The sky over Newport wasn't just gray. It was the color of a 3-day-old bruise, throbbing with a violence that threatened to crack the world open. A nor'easter was hammering the Rhode Island coast, turning the Atlantic into a churning cauldron of black foam and fury. But the man sitting inside the matte black 2026 Rolls-Royce Spectre felt nothing but a cold, predatory satisfaction. Victor Vance didn't come to Obsidian Ridge to mourn. He came to gloat. The electric vehicle, silent as a phantom and sleek as a shark, cut through the driving rain, looking alien against the decaying 19th century Gothic architecture of the private Vance family cemetery. To the outside world, this was a pilgrimage of grief. To Victor, it was a victory lap. The car glided to a halt before the wrought iron gates, the V crest rusting under a century of salt spray. The silence inside the cabin was absolute, a hermetically sealed bubble of wealth that cost $500,000 to maintain. Victor checked his reflection in the rearview mirror. 42 years old. The face of a Roman emperor carved from ice, not a single gray hair. He opened the door, and the roar of the ocean assaulted him instantly. Victor stepped out, his Italian leather Testoni loafers sinking immediately into the freezing, sucking mud. A normal man would have flinched at the destruction of $3,000 shoes. Victor didn't even blink. He buttoned his bespoke Tom Ford trench coat, the fabric worth more than the average American's annual mortgage payments, and adjusted the black silk armband on his left sleeve. It was a ridiculous, archaic tradition, a Victorian signal of deep mourning that his mother, Eleanor Vance, had mandated in her will. Wear the band or lose the board seat. Even from the grave, the Iron Matriarch tried to wrap her cold fingers around his throat. "Joke's on you, Mother," Victor muttered, the wind snatching the words from his lips. He wasn't holding a Bible or a rosary. In his left hand, protected by a velvet casing, was a Fabergé egg, the Winter Imperial, encrusted with 3,000 diamonds and worth a cool $2 million. In his right hand, he gripped a bouquet of rare Juliet roses, their peach petals trembling violently in the gale. He began the ascent toward the family mausoleum, a monstrosity of white marble perched on the highest cliff edge. Every step was a declaration of war. 7 years, he thought, his jaw tightening. You thought the company would die with you. You thought I was too soft, too broken by that little gold-digging whore, Lily. The wind howled like a banshee, but Victor's internal monologue was louder. He had done the impossible. He had taken Vance Biocorp from the brink of bankruptcy, where Eleanor's dementia-fueled paranoia had driven it, and turned it into a global titan. The stock had closed at an all-time high yesterday. The hostile takeover of their biggest competitor was complete. And the final nail in the coffin? He touched the breast pocket of his coat, where the ultrasound picture rested against his heart. Tiffany. Beautiful. 24-year-old Tiffany, the senator's daughter. She was everything Lily never was. Obedient, pedigree, and fertile. The IVF had worked on the first try. A son. A true Vance heir was growing in her womb right now. "I won," Victor whispered, a cruel smile cutting across his face as the marble tomb loomed ahead, white and ghostly in the lightning flashes. "I fixed the fortune. I secured the bloodline. And I did it all without you." He reached the top of the ridge, ready to place the diamond egg on her cold stone slab as the ultimate insult, a symbol that he was rich enough to leave millions in a crypt just to prove a point. He was the king of Newport, standing on the bones of his ancestors, untouchable and invincible. But as the lightning split the sky again, illuminating the base of the mausoleum, Victor froze. The world tilted. The triumph in his chest turned into a shard of ice. He wasn't alone. The lightning that split the sky didn't just illuminate the marble tomb. It cracked open the sealed vault of Victor's memory. As his Italian leather shoes slipped on the slick, moss-covered stairs leading up to the crypt, the smell of ozone and rotting leaves vanished. Suddenly, he wasn't standing in a storm in 2026. He was back in the suffocating silence of the Vance Manor master suite 7 years ago. The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow, staggering him mid-step. It was the night the dynasty nearly died. He remembered pushing open the heavy mahogany doors to his mother's sanctuary, expecting the usual scent of lavender and starch. Instead, the air had been thick with the cloying, sweet stench of decay, masked by expensive room spray. There, in the center of the four-poster bed that had birthed 3 generations of tycoons, lay Eleanor Vance. She wasn't the iron-fisted matriarch who terrified board members with a single arched eyebrow. She was a husk, a skeletal ruin draped in Egyptian cotton. Victor had rushed to her side, his heart hammering against his ribs, but when he pulled back the silk duvet, the scream died in his throat. Bruises. They were everywhere, violently purple, sickeningly yellow, mapping the geography of her withered arms and chest like constellations of abuse. They were the marks of fingers. Human fingers. Victor stood frozen on the cemetery stairs, the rain lashing his face, but his mind was replaying the forensic analysis of that horrific moment. His logic had been instant and absolute. Eleanor had been bedridden, helpless. There was only one person who had insisted on caring for her alone, one person who had barred the nurses, claiming it was for privacy. Lily. "You monster!" Victor hissed into the wind, the venom as fresh as it was 7 years ago. He remembered tearing through the house, screaming Lily's name, ready to drag her before the police. He had stormed into their shared bedroom, expecting to find her packing stolen jewelry. But the room was pristine, sterile, empty. The only thing remaining of his wife was on the antique vanity table, sitting next to his mother's untouched bottle of heart medication. A single, typed letter. No tear stains, no handwritten scrawl of emotion, just cold Helvetica font on crisp white paper. Next to it lay a stack of legal documents, a pre-signed non-disclosure agreement and divorce papers, the signatures already drying in blue ink. Victor remembered the way his hands shook as he picked up the note. He could still recite every word. They were branded onto his retinas like a scar. "Victor, I can't do this anymore. I'm tired of waiting for an old woman to die just to get a taste of freedom. And frankly, I'm tired of you. You play the big businessman, but we both know the truth. You're a biological dead end. I'm leaving you for a real man, someone who can actually give me a child, not just a trust fund. Don't look for me. Just sign the papers and keep your money. It's the only thing you're good at making." The emasculation had been surgical, precise, fatal. Standing there in the empty bedroom, holding the paper that declared him half a man, Victor hadn't cried. He hadn't collapsed. Something inside him, the soft, hopeful part that had actually loved the scholarship girl with the bright eyes, had simply snapped. It calcified instantly into something harder than diamond. He remembered looking at the mirror that night. The grief evaporated, replaced by a cold fusion reactor rage. "She thinks I'm weak," he had thought, staring at his reflection. "She thinks I'm just a checkbook? I'll show her. I'll show the world." That letter was the fuel for the Wolf of Wall Street transformation the media fawned over. For 7 years, Victor didn't sleep. He hunted. He didn't just run Vance Biocorp. He weaponized it. He crushed competitors not for profit, but for sport. Every hostile takeover, every ruthless merger, every $1 billion added to the ledger was a direct rebuttal to that type note. He became a predator because Lily Miller had convinced him he was prey. "I proved you wrong, didn't I?" Victor snarled, shaking the rain from his eyes. Coming back to the present. "I have the money, I have the power, and now I have the sun." He checked the Cartier tank watch on his wrist, shielding the face from the deluge. The crystal caught the gray light. 1:40 p.m. He had exactly 20 minutes. 20 minutes to drop off this $2 million paperweight, say a hollow prayer over the mother he failed to protect from his ex-wife's cruelty, and get back to the car. The board of directors was expecting him on a secure Zoom call at 2 p.m. sharp to discuss the Asian market expansion. This wasn't a visit, it was a transaction, a box to be checked on his schedule of dominance. Victor adjusted his grip on the Fabergé egg and took the final step onto the plateau of the mausoleum. He was ready to leave the past behind, buried under the wet earth. He was ready to walk away and never think of Lily Miller or Eleanor's bruises again. But the storm had other plans. The wind shrieked, tearing at his coat, and as Victor looked toward the base of the crypt, the arrogance in his eyes was about to be extinguished by a horror he couldn't have calculated in any spreadsheet. Victor crested the final rise of Obsidian Ridge, and the full violence of the Atlantic Ocean hit him like a physical blow. The Vance Mausoleum stood at the edge of the cliff, a neoclassical temple of white marble that seemed to glow with a ghostly luminescence against the bruised purple bruises of the storm clouds. It was a fortress for the dead, built to withstand centuries of salt spray and silence, a testament to the family's obsession with permanence. But as Victor approached the crypt, ready to perform his hollow ritual and retreat to the warmth of his Rolls-Royce, the perfect stark geometry of the scene was ruined by a grotesque anomaly. At the base of the central tomb, where his mother's name, Eleanor Rose Vance, was chiseled in gold leaf, there was a pile of garbage. Victor stopped dead, his Italian leather shoes sinking deeper into the saturated earth, his brow furrowed in a mix of confusion and elitist outrage. This was a private estate, guarded by a security system that cost more than the GDP of a small island nation. Motion sensors, thermal cameras, armed patrols. How could a pile of refuse be sitting on the sacred ground of the Vance dynasty? Then the pile moved. It wasn't garbage. It was a human being, a figure draped in layers of sodden gray rags that looked like they had been scavenged from a dumpster, was huddled on the ground. They were on their knees, bent over the pristine white base of the tomb in a posture of abject desperation. Victor's initial shock curdled instantly into fury. A squatter, a junkie from the city, had somehow breached the perimeter to shoot up or sleep off a high on his mother's grave. The sheer disrespect made the bile rise in his throat. He tightened his grip on the velvet box containing the Fabergé egg, his knuckles turning white. He marched forward, ready to shout, ready to call the security detail and have this filth dragged away in handcuffs. But as he got closer, the sound of the wind was pierced by a strange, rhythmic scratching sound. Scrape, gasp, scrape, gasp. The figure wasn't sleeping. They were working. Victor slowed his pace, narrowing his eyes against the stinging rain. The intruder was scrubbing the base of the marble tomb, but there was no brush, no cloth. They were using their bare hands. Victor watched, paralyzed by the sheer mania of the act. The hands were raw, the skin scrubbed away, leaving trails of fresh, bright blood smearing across the wet white stone. The rain would wash the blood down, and the figure would frantically scrub it away again, only to bleed more, creating a horrifying, endless loop of self-destruction. "Hey!" Victor barked, his voice booming over the roar of the surf. "Get away from there!" The figure froze. The scrubbing stopped. The hunched shoulders tensed under the soaked rags. A crack of lightning, brighter and closer than before, tore the sky open. In that split second of electric daylight, the figure turned to look up at him. The world stopped. The sound of the ocean vanished. The cold rain ceased to exist. All Victor could see was the face staring back at him from the mud. It was a nightmare of duality. The right side of the face was beautiful, painfully, familiarly so. The high cheekbone, the delicate arch of the brow, the large, terrified hazel eye. It was the face that had haunted his dreams and fueled his hatred for 7 long years. It was the face of the woman who had written that letter. Lily. But the left side. Victor's breath hitched in a strangled gasp. The left side of her face was a melted ruin. It was a chaotic map of shiny, fused scar tissue where skin had been boiled and dragged. The ear was gone, replaced by a nub of flesh. The left eye drooped, unable to fully close, staring out with a fixed, watery gaze. The corner of her mouth was pulled tight, permanently fusing her jaw into a grimace of silent screaming. She looked like a porcelain doll that had been held over a lighter flame. "No!" The word fell from Victor's lips, void of air. His brain tried to reject the visual data. This couldn't be Lily Miller. Lily was in Europe. Lily was with her real man, living off the $5 million she had extorted from him. Lily was young, vibrant, and laughing at his sterility. She couldn't be this skeletal, broken creature shivering in the mud of a Rhode Island cemetery. The shock severed the connection between his brain and his hand. The velvet box slipped from his fingers. The Fabergé egg, the $2 million symbol of his conquest, the Winter Imperial, meant to prove his ultimate victory over his mother's doubts, tumbled into the muck. It didn't break, it was too well made for that, but it rolled ignobly through a puddle of dirty rainwater, coming to rest against Lily's bleeding knee. The irony was shattering. The priceless treasure lay in the dirt, and the woman he had demonized as a gold digger stared up at him with the face of a monster. Victor stood there, the rain soaking through his $10,000 coat, unable to move. The hate that had sustained him for 7 years collided violently with the horror of what he was seeing, creating a cognitive dissonance that threatened to bring him to his knees. Lily didn't speak. She just looked at him, her good eye wide with terror, her ruined eye weeping rain. And then she did the unthinkable. She reached out with a trembling, bloody hand, not for the diamond egg, but to wipe a speck of mud off his shoe. The touch of her bloody, raw fingers against the toe of his bespoke loafer acted like a defibrillator to Victor's paralyzed senses. But it didn't wake up his compassion. It woke up his disgust. He jerked his foot back as if a viper had struck him, the motion so violent that Lily fell sideways into the mud, landing heavily on her hip. Victor stared down at the wretched creature, cowering before him, and his mind, trained in the brutal Darwinism of Wall Street, frantically reorganized the data. The cognitive dissonance vanished, replaced by a cold, sneering certainty. The puzzle pieces clicked into place, forming a picture that fit perfectly with his prejudices. This wasn't a tragedy. This was consequence. Meth. Victor whispered, the word hissing through his teeth like steam. Or fentanyl. Is that it, Lily? It made perfect sense to him. The melted face, the emaciated frame, the incomprehensible behavior in a storm. He had read the reports. He knew what happened to people who won the lottery and didn't have the breeding to handle it. She had taken his $5 million, run off with some low-life lover, and snorted, smoked, and injected her way into oblivion. The scar on her face wasn't from a fire. It was likely from a drug deal gone wrong, or a pimp's retribution for a debt unpaid. A dark, toxic wave of vindication washed over him. He felt taller. The storm felt less cold. "Look at you," Victor sneered, his voice rising over the howling wind, dripping with the arrogance of a man who believes wealth is a moral virtue. "I spent 7 years hating you. 7 years wondering if you were laughing at me on a yacht in the Mediterranean. But you weren't. Were you?" He stepped closer, looming over her like a dark monolith. "You were rotting," he said, the cruelty in his tone sharp enough to cut glass. "You left me to chase your real man, to chase your pleasure, and this is where it got you. Face down in the dirt, scratching at the grave of the woman you tormented." Lily didn't answer. She didn't even seem to hear him. She was scrambling back onto her knees, her good eye wide and unblinking, fixed on a cheap, cracked plastic bucket she had been using to haul rainwater to clean the tomb. The sight of that bucket, a piece of dollar store trash polluting his family's sacred resting place, snapped the last thread of Victor's restraint. "Stop it!" Victor roared. He lashed out with his foot, kicking the plastic bucket with all his strength. It clattered loudly against the marble steps, skittering away into the darkness of the cemetery. The sound was sharp and pathetic, echoing like a gunshot. Lily let out a sharp, animalistic whimper. She curled in on herself, instinctively throwing her arms up to protect her head. The movement caused the wet, shredded sleeves of her oversized sweater to slide down, exposing her forearms for the first time. Victor froze again. The lightning flashed, illuminating her skin. It wasn't smooth. Her forearms were a road map of violence. Jagged white ridges of scar tissue crisscrossed the flesh. Some were old and silver, others looked angry and pink. They weren't needle tracks, they were gouges. Victor's memory flashed back to the corpse of his mother, the bruises, the marks he had found that night 7 years ago. The narrative in his head solidified into concrete. "I knew it," he breathed. The realization horrific and intoxicating. "I knew you were violent." He grabbed Lily by the shoulder of her coat, hauling her up to her knees. She was light, terrifyingly light, like a bundle of dry twigs held together by rags. "You hit her, didn't you?" Victor yelled into her ruined face, shaking her. "I saw the bruises on her body the night she died. I knew you were hurting her, and now look at your arms. Is that from the fights? Did she fight back?" Lily stared at him. Her pupil dilated to the size of a dinner plate. She was trembling so hard her teeth chattered, a sound like dry bones rattling in a cup. "And now you're back here?" Victor continued, his rage blinding him to the terror in her eyes. "Why? Is the 5 million gone? Are you looking for buried jewelry? Did you come to rob the woman you abused?" He released her with a shove. She collapsed back into the mud, panting, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Victor expected a denial. He expected her to scream, to curse him, to beg for money. He expected the gold digger he had created in his mind to show her true colors. But Lily didn't ask for money. She didn't look at Victor. Her gaze drifted past him, unfocused, staring at the empty air above the marble tombstone. She began to rock back and forth, a rhythmic, soothing motion that looked terrifying against the backdrop of the storm. Her lips moved. At first, it was silent. Then a whisper emerged, cutting through the wind with a chilling clarity. "The tea is too hot. Mrs. Vance." Victor frowned, stepping back. "What?" Lily rocked harder, her bloody hands wringing together in a pantomime of washing. Her voice pitched up, trembling with a frantic, desperate apology meant for a ghost. "I'm sorry. I'll make it cooler," she whimpered, tears streaming from her good eye, mixing with the rain and the mud on her cheek. "Please don't be angry. I'll fix it. Don't spill it. I won't let it burn you. I promise." She wasn't talking to him. She wasn't even in 2026. She was trapped in a loop of servitude and terror, apologizing to the very woman whose name was chiseled into the stone. Victor stared at her, the accusation dying on his lips. He heard the words, but his heart, hardened by years of resentment, refused to decode them. He saw madness. He saw guilt. He saw a junkie's delirium. "Pathetic," he muttered, turning his back on her to shield his face from the stinging rain. Absolutely pathetic. He didn't know that the madness he was witnessing was the only thing that had kept his mother's dignity intact. He didn't know that the guilt was actually a trauma response so severe it had shattered her psyche. He stood there, judging the wreckage, unaware that the ground beneath his moral high horse was about to collapse. Victor reached into his coat pocket, his fingers closing around his satellite phone. He was done with this grotesque theater. The pity he might have felt for a stranger was entirely absent for the woman he believed had dismantled his life. "I'm calling security." Victor announced, his voice flat and final. "And then I'm calling the police." "I don't know what kind of sick penance you think you're performing, Lily, but you're not doing it on my property." He pulled the phone out, the blue light of the screen illuminating the rain-slicked marble. He was dialing the head of his private security detail when a blur of gray motion slammed into him from the shadows of the crypt. It wasn't a spectral force. It was 70 pounds of raw, geriatric rage. Arthur, the estate's 70-year-old groundskeeper, a man Victor had fired via email 5 years ago, but who had simply refused to leave the grounds, hit the billionaire with the force of a linebacker. Victor stumbled back, dropping the phone into the mud. He caught his balance on the edge of a stone urn, his eyes widening in shock. Arthur stood between him and the cowering form of Lily, a rusted shovel gripped in his gnarled hands like a broadsword. "Don't you touch her," Arthur rasped. His raincoat was tattered, his face weathered like old leather, but his eyes burned with a ferocity that made Victor pause. Victor straightened his trench coat, regaining his composure. "Arthur, I should have known. So, you're the one harboring this addict? You realize you're both trespassing on private land? I can have you arrested for assault before the hour is up." Arthur didn't flinch. He turned his head and spat a glob of tobacco and saliva onto the ground, missing the toe of Victor's ruined Italian loafer by an inch. "Call him," Arthur challenged, his voice cracking with emotion. "Call the cops. Let him come see the woman who saved your damn legacy while you were busy playing God in a boardroom." "Saved my legacy?" Victor let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "She abused my mother. I saw the proof, Arthur. The night she died, Eleanor was covered in bruises. I saw them with my own eyes." "You saw what you wanted to see," Arthur roared, stepping forward, the shovel clanging against the stone. "You saw bruises and you thought abuse, because it was easier than looking at the truth. You thought your mother just had old age? You thought she was just a little forgetful?" Victor frowned. "She had dementia. We knew that." "She had Lewy body dementia with Capgras delusion." Arthur screamed the medical terms into the storm, the words hanging heavy in the air. "She didn't know who Lily was. She didn't know who I was. Her brain told her we were imposters, spies, assassins sent to poison her." The wind howled, but the silence following Arthur's declaration was deafening. Victor stood still. Capgras delusion. The syndrome where a patient believes their loved ones have been replaced by identical doubles. "The bruises on her arms?" Arthur continued, his voice dropping to a growl. "She did those to herself, Victor. Night terrors. She'd wake up screaming, thinking the bedsheets were snakes, thinking the IV lines were ropes. She'd thrash and hit the walls. And who was there? Not you. You were in London. You were in Tokyo. You were securing the IPO." "Lily. Lily was supposed to restrain her," Victor stammered, his certainty wavering for the first time. "Restrain a woman who thinks she's fighting for her life?" Arthur shook his head with disgust. "Lily didn't restrain her. Lily absorbed her." Arthur threw the shovel down. He turned, grabbed Lily's arm, the one Victor had just accused of being track-marked, and ripped the sodden woolen sleeve all the way up to the shoulder. "Look," Arthur commanded, shoving the limb into the beam of the landscape lighting. "You want to talk about abuse? You want to talk about violence? Look at the price she paid to keep your mother quiet." Victor looked. He didn't want to, but he couldn't look away. The scars on Lily's forearm weren't the straight surgical lines of self-harm, nor the chaotic punctures of needles. They were crescents, dozens of them. Some were faint silvery echoes of old pain. Others were jagged craters where tissue had been ripped away. They were distinct oval shapes consisting of two opposing arcs. They were teeth marks, human teeth marks. "She bit her," Arthur whispered, the horror of the statement cutting through Victor's soul. When the episodes got bad, Eleanor would bite. She'd clamp down like a trap. And Lily, that girl never screamed. Not once. She'd let your mother chew on her arm until the blood ran, just to calm her down, just so she wouldn't wake you up. Victor stared at the mauled flesh of his ex-wife's arm. The geometry of the scars was undeniable. "Why?" Victor breathed, his voice barely audible. "Why didn't she tell me? Why didn't she call the nurses?" "Because of the stock," Arthur yelled, gesturing to the distant lights of the mansion. "The Vance family PR policy. No weakness, no scandals." If the street found out the matriarch was a violent lunatic, your precious stock would have tanked before the opening bell. Lily became a human chew toy to protect your inheritance, Victor. She let herself be eaten alive so you could stay rich. Victor looked from the bite marks on Lily's arm to the grave of his mother. The image of the gold digger cracked. A fissure ran right down the center of his hate, and through the gap, a terrifying, blinding light began to shine. He wasn't looking at a junkie. He was looking at a soldier who had taken the bullets meant for him. Victor stared at the jagged bite marks on Lily's arm, his stomach churning with a nausea that had nothing to do with the storm. The narrative of the violent gold digger was dissolving, washing away in the torrential rain, leaving behind something raw and uncomfortable. But his ego, a fortress built over 7 years of resentment, desperately sought a defensive position. He needed a villain that wasn't his mother. He needed a sin that wasn't his negligence. His eyes snapped up to Lily's face, that ruined, melted landscape of scar tissue on the left side. "Fine," Victor stammered, his voice brittle. "The arms. Maybe that was Mother. She was sick. I accept that. But that?" He pointed a trembling finger at Lily's disfigured cheek and fused jaw. "A geriatric woman didn't do that, Arthur. Teeth didn't do that. That's a chemical burn. Or fire." He stepped closer to Arthur, desperate for validation. "Did her lover do that? That real man she left me for? Did he beat her when the money ran out? Is that why she's here, hiding in a cemetery?" Arthur looked at Victor with an expression that was terrifyingly void of anger. It was pity, pure, unadulterated pity for a man so blinded by his own narrative that he couldn't see the tragedy standing right in front of him. "You really don't know, do you?" Arthur said softly, his voice cutting through the howling wind like a blade. "You think there was a lover? You think there was a real man?" Arthur let out a short, bitter laugh that sounded like dry leaves being crushed. "There was never a man, Victor. There was only the tea." "The tea?" Victor frowned. "What are you talking about?" "It happened 1 week before Eleanor died," Arthur began, looking down at Lily, who was still rocking back and forth, whispering apologies to the invisible matriarch. "It was a Tuesday. I remember because the cook had the day off. Lily was bringing up the afternoon tray, English breakfast, piping hot, just the way your mother liked it." Arthur's eyes drifted to the heavy silver ring on Victor's finger, a family crest. It was the George III sterling silver pot, the heavy one, the heirloom. Victor knew the pot. It had been in the family for 100 years, a symbol of Vance hospitality. "Eleanor was having a bad day," Arthur continued, his voice monotone, reciting the horror. "The capgrass was peaking. She looked at Lily and didn't see the daughter-in-law who had been wiping her chin and changing her sheets for months. She saw an assassin. She saw a poisoner." Arthur mimed a throwing motion. Lily leaned in to pour the cup. She was smiling. She was trying to be gentle. And Eleanor. She didn't just knock the pot over. She picked it up. She looked Lily dead in the eye, screamed, "Die, witch!" and threw the boiling contents directly into her face. Victor stopped breathing. The image assaulted him. The steam, the splash, the smell. "It was 200 degrees, Victor," Arthur whispered. "It hit her left side, the eye, the cheek, the neck. The skin didn't just burn. It slid." "Why didn't she go to the hospital?" Victor shouted, the logic of the wealthy surfacing instantly. "Why are there no records? If she was burned that badly, there would be a police report, an ambulance." And who would have called them? Arthur stepped into Victor's personal space, smelling of wet wool and tobacco. "You? I was in Tokyo closing the merger. Exactly, Arthur barked. And what were your standing orders regarding the estate? No scandals, no sirens, nothing that disturbs the neighbors or the shareholders. Arthur pointed a gnarled finger at the Vance mansion looming on the hill. Lily knew the rules. If the press found out the great Eleanor Vance had mutilated her daughter-in-law in a fit of madness, the stock would have plummeted. The board would have declared Eleanor incompetent. You would have lost control of the company. Victor felt the blood drain from his face. So she went to the basement, Arthur said, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. She sat on a folding chair next to the boiler. She put drugstore burn ointment and bags of frozen peas on a third-degree burn that was eating through her nerves. She stifled her screams with a towel so the neighbors wouldn't hear. She sat there in the dark, shaking in shock, guarding your reputation with her own flesh. Victor looked down at the woman in the mud. The monster he had created in his mind, the vanity-obsessed, shallow girl, was gone. In her place was a martyr who had been tortured in his own home, under his own roof, to protect his bank account. But the worst part? Arthur's voice broke, tears welling in his old eyes. The worst part wasn't the burn. It was an hour later. What could possibly be worse? Victor whispered. Eleanor got hungry, Arthur said. She started ringing that damn bell of hers, and she wouldn't eat from me. She wouldn't eat from the maid. She only wanted the nice girl. She'd already forgotten she threw the tea, Victor. She'd reset. Arthur pointed at Lily, who was still shivering violently under Victor's coat. So Lily got up. With half her face melted off, with her eyes swollen shut, she got up. She put a fresh bandage on, she made a fresh pot of tea, lukewarm this time, and she walked back up those stairs. She fed the woman who disfigured her. She spooned soup into Eleanor's mouth while the heat from the bowl radiated onto her fresh burns. And she smiled. She smiled because if she cried, Eleanor would get upset again. Victor felt his knees give way. The armor of the righteous victim shattered completely. He wasn't the hero of this story. He wasn't the conqueror. He was the absentee landlord of a torture chamber. She didn't leave you for a lover, Victor, Arthur finished, his voice heavy with the weight of 7 years of silence. She left because she had nothing left to give. You and your mother, you consumed her. You ate her alive. Victor looked at the gold digger. He looked at the scars, and for the first time in his life, the billionaire felt completely and utterly bankrupt. The rain had turned the ground beneath their feet into a slurry of mud and ice, but Victor Vance felt scorched. The heat of shame was rising in his chest, radiating outward, burning away the cold superiority he had worn like armor for so long. He looked down at the woman shivering in the dirt, the woman who had smiled while her face melted to protect his stock options, and felt the first hairline fracture in his sanity. "Is that it?" Victor asked, his voice hollow, barely audible over the gale. "Is that the whole truth, Arthur? She stayed to be a punching bag?" Arthur didn't answer immediately. He knelt in the mud beside Lily's rotting canvas backpack, his movements slow and deliberate, like a priest preparing a sacrament. He unzipped the main compartment and pulled out the only object inside that wasn't trash or rags. It was a gallon-sized Ziploc freezer bag. The banality of the object struck Victor as absurd. Here, on the grounds of a billion-dollar estate, the truth was preserved in a 50-cent plastic bag meant for leftovers. Inside, a sheaf of papers remained miraculously dry. "You think the tea was the worst of it?" Arthur stood up, thrusting the plastic bag into Victor's chest. "The tea was just pain, Victor. Pain heals, skin grafts over. But a lie? A lie rots you from the inside out." Victor took the bag. His hands, usually steady enough to sign billion-dollar merger deals, were shaking violently. He opened the seal. The first document was a medical chart from the Vance private physician. It was dated 7 years ago. Patient, Eleanor Rose Vance. Diagnosis, Lewy body dementia with Capgras syndrome, advanced stage. Notes: patient exhibits extreme paranoia and violent tendencies toward primary caregiver. L. Vance. Recommendation: immediate institutionalization. I never saw this, Victor whispered, staring at the damning black ink. The board told me it was mild cognitive decline. Because Lily buried it, Arthur snapped. She hid the diagnosis so you wouldn't be removed as CEO during the merger. But keep reading. The second paper. That's the one that cost her everything. Victor pulled out the second document. It was on heavy, cream-colored letterhead from the Boston Center for Reproductive Health, the most expensive fertility clinic on the East Coast. Victor remembered this clinic. He remembered the humiliating exams, the cups, the waiting rooms filled with hopeful couples. He remembered the day the results came back. Lily had walked into his office, tears in her eyes, and told him the doctors said her uterus was hostile. She had told him she was broken. She had told him she couldn't give him the one thing a Vance needed, an heir, but the paper in his hand didn't say Lily Miller Vance. Patient, Victor Sterling Vance. Doe B, 02-14-1984. Diagnosis: complete azoospermia, genetic Y chromosome deletion. Prognosis: sterility, conception impossible. The world tilted on its axis. The roar of the ocean faded into a high-pitched tinnitus, ringing in Victor's ears. No, Victor breathed, the paper crinkling in his grip. This is a mistake. This is fake. Tiffany is pregnant right now. The IVF worked. We're having a son. Tiffany is pregnant with a donor's sperm, or she's lying to you, son, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a brutal, gravelly whisper. But that paper isn't fake. That is your biology. You are the end of the line, Victor. You always were. But Lily told me... Victor looked down at the cowering woman, his mind reeling. She said she was the problem. She said her body failed. She bought that diagnosis, Arthur said, pointing a trembling finger at the document. Look at the date. It was 2 days after your mother threatened her. Threatened her? Eleanor told Lily that if she didn't produce an heir within the year, she would cut you out of the will, Arthur explained, the wind whipping his gray hair around his face. She was going to dissolve the trust, sell the company, and leave you with nothing but your name. She blamed Lily for the delay. So Lily went to the clinic. She got the results. She found out you were the one shooting blanks. Victor felt like he had been gutted. The masculinity he had spent 7 years proving, the virility he flaunted with his young fiancée, was a mirage. She knew if she showed you that paper, it would destroy you, Arthur continued, relentless. It would destroy your ego, and worse, it would destroy your inheritance. Eleanor would have seen you as defective stock. She would have cut you off. Arthur grabbed Victor's lapels, forcing the billionaire to look at him. So Lily paid the doctor to switch the files. She took the blame, Victor. She told the world she was barren. She let your mother scream at her, call her a dried-up mule, call her useless trash. She took that weight so you could keep your pride and your money. Victor looked back at the Dear John letter in his memory. The words that had fueled his hatred for 7 years suddenly rearranged themselves into a different message. I'm leaving you for a real man, someone who can actually give me a child. It wasn't an insult. It was a performance. The letter, Victor choked out, tears finally spilling over his freezing cheeks. The letter about the real man. She had to make you hate her, Arthur said softly, releasing his grip. If she just left, you would have chased her. You would have tried to fix it. She had to break your heart so completely that you would let her go. She had to make herself the villain so you could be the victim. She orchestrated a fake affair, Victor. There was no other man. There was never anyone else. Victor looked at the document again. Complete azoospermia. He looked at the woman in the mud. She hadn't left him for money. She hadn't left him for pleasure. She had exiled herself to a trailer park, accepted poverty, and destroyed her own reputation just to ensure that Victor Vance didn't feel like less of a man. She had starved in the cold so his fragile ego could stay warm. The millions in his bank account, the accolades, the magazine covers, they suddenly felt like heavy stones tied around his neck, dragging him down into the crushing depth of his own ignorance. He had built an empire on the back of a woman he had thrown away like garbage. The medical file in Victor's hand felt heavier than lead, anchoring him to the spot, but Arthur wasn't done dismantling the billionaire's reality. The old groundskeeper turned away from the cowering woman and scanned the muddy ground until he found what he was looking for: a cracked, translucent plastic Tupperware container that had fallen from Lily's backpack during the scuffle. "You called her a gold digger," Arthur spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of grief and fury. "You told yourself she was out living the high life. Champagne, caviar, young lovers." With a sudden violent motion, Arthur kicked the container. The plastic lid popped off, skittering across the wet marble. The contents spilled out into the mud, landing right next to the $2 million Fabergé egg. It wasn't jewelry. It wasn't drugs. It was half a bagel, green with mold on one side, and 3 crinkled packets of ketchup scavenged from a fast food counter. Victor stared at the wretched meal. His stomach lurched. Just an hour ago, his assistant had confirmed a reservation at the White Horse Tavern, America's oldest restaurant, for a celebratory lunch. He had planned to order the beef Wellington and a bottle of Chateau Margaux to toast his own brilliance. "That is her feast, Victor," Arthur said, gesturing to the rotting bread dissolving in the rain. "That is what she eats, every single day." "But," Victor's voice was a broken whisper, "the settlement. I gave her $5 million. It was the get-out-of-hell price. I signed the check myself." "You think she spent it?" Arthur let out a hollow, incredulous laugh. "You think the woman who let your mother use her arm as a chew toy took your money to go shopping?" Arthur reached back into the sodden canvas bag and pulled out a small blue vinyl booklet. It was a standard savings passbook from a local credit union, the kind given to children opening their first accounts. He shoved it into Victor's chest, forcing him to drop the medical files to catch it. "Open it," Arthur commanded. "Look at the fortune of the woman you just kicked." Victor opened the book. The pages were stiff with humidity. His eyes scanned the ledger lines. Deposit, 5,000. Wire transfer. Date, October 14th, 2019. Victor's eyes shot down the column, looking for the withdrawals. He expected to see Ferraris, penthouses, vacations. He expected to see the hemorrhaging of wealth that justified his contempt. Withdrawal, 0 zeros. Withdrawal, 0 zeros. Withdrawal, 0 zeros. Year after year, 7 years of interest accumulating. The balance at the bottom was nearly $7 million. Not a single cent had been touched, not even for a coat, not even for a fresh bagel. "She didn't take a dime," Victor breathed, the numbers blurring before his eyes. "She's been living in a trailer park, starving, with $7 million in the bank." "She lives in the Sunnyside lot 5 miles down the coast," Arthur corrected him, his tone stripping away any remaining dignity Victor thought he possessed. "The heating broke 2 winters ago. She sleeps in a sleeping bag she found at Goodwill. She walks here every day, 5 miles in the snow, 5 miles in the heat, to apologize to a dead woman." "Apologize for what?" Victor asked, his voice cracking. "She didn't do anything." "She thinks she failed," Arthur said, looking down at Lily, who was still rocking, oblivious to the vindication happening above her. Eleanor died of heart failure while Lily was in the basement, changing the bandages on her face. Lily thinks if she hadn't been so weak, if she hadn't needed to tend to her burns, she would have been upstairs. She thinks she could have saved her. Victor felt like he was suffocating. The guilt was a physical weight, crushing his lungs. Lily wasn't just a victim of his mother's madness. She was a prisoner of her own twisted loyalty. She was serving a life sentence for a crime she didn't commit, imposed by a husband who wasn't even there. "Read the note," Arthur whispered, pointing to a yellow post-it stuck to the inside cover of the bank book. Victor peeled the sticky note back. The handwriting was shaky, written perhaps in the dark or with a hand trembling from pain, but the message was clear. For Victor's baby. So the Vance line continues. I'm sorry I couldn't give it to him. The world went silent. The gold digger narrative didn't just die. It evaporated, leaving behind a vacuum of pure, unadulterated shame. She hadn't kept the money for herself. She had hoarded it, protected it, starved for it, all to give it back to the child she believed Victor would have with another woman. She believed his lie about the real man. She believed she was the broken one. And in her twisted, beautiful, tragic logic, she decided that if she couldn't give him an heir with her body, she would ensure his heir was the richest child in Newport with her alimony. She was financing the legacy of the man who hated her. Victor looked at the moldy bagel in the mud. He looked at the bank book worth $7 million. And then he looked at the woman shivering under his coat. He had called her a monster. He had mocked her suffering. But as he stood there in the freezing rain, holding the proof of her sainthood in his hands, Victor Vance realized the terrifying truth. He was the beggar. She was the queen, and he had spent 7 years throwing stones at the only person in the world who had ever truly loved him. The bank book slipped from Victor's numb fingers, landing face up in the slush. The numbers, balance $7,024,950 stared up at him, a silent indictment of his entire existence. Beside it lay the Fabergé egg, the winter imperial, glittering obscenely in the mud. For 7 years, Victor had measured his worth by the weight of things, the weight of gold bars, the weight of board votes, the weight of his family name. But as he looked down at Lily, who had finally succumbed to the cold and collapsed into a pile of wet gray rags, he realized he was holding nothing but dust. The ego of the Wolf of Wall Street didn't just crack, it disintegrated. Victor dropped to his knees. The Italian trousers, tailored in Milan, soaked up the freezing groundwater. He didn't feel it. He reached out and touched Lily's shoulder. She didn't move. Her skin was the color of blue milk. "Lily?" he choked out, his voice raw. She was gone, drifted away into the hypothermic dark. Victor frantically unbuttoned his trench coat, the $10,000 armor of cashmere and silk designed to keep him separate from the world. He stripped it off, not caring as the freezing wind bit into his dress shirt. He wrapped the heavy, warm fabric around her wasted frame, tucking the collar up to cover the melted ruin of her cheek. Then he lifted her. The sensation nearly broke him. She weighed nothing. She felt less like a woman and more like a bundle of hollow bird bones held together by scar tissue and sheer will. He remembered lifting her over the threshold on their wedding day. She had been solid, warm, laughing. Now he was carrying a ghost. "I've got you," Victor whispered, standing up, his shoes slipping in the mud. "I've got you, and I'm never letting go." He ignored the $2 million egg lying in the dirt. He left it there, a piece of trash for the worms. He turned his back on the mausoleum, on the legacy, on the lies, and marched down the hill toward the waiting hearse-black Rolls-Royce. Arthur didn't try to stop him. The old groundskeeper just stood in the rain, watching the boy finally become a man. Victor kicked the car door open, startling the driver who was busy scrolling on his phone. "Sir?" the driver gasped, seeing the mud, the blood, and the bundle in Victor's arms. "Sir, the upholstery." "Open the door!" Victor roared, a sound so primal it made the driver flinch. Victor settled Lily into the back seat, the cream leather instantly staining brown and red. He barked at the car's AI to maximize the heat and pulled her onto his lap, rocking her, trying to transfer his own body heat into her cold core. "Lily, stay with me," he pleaded, rubbing her frozen hands. Her eyes fluttered open, but they didn't see him. They rolled wildly, unfocused, trapped in the nightmare of the last 7 years. Her hand, shaking violently, clawed at the lapel of his shirt. "Mr. Vance," she wheezed, her voice a terrifying, raspy whistle. "Please, don't fire Arthur." Victor froze. "Lily, it's me." "It's Victor." "I'll clean the floors better," she deliriously begged, tears leaking from her one good eye. "Take it out of my pay. I promise. The tea won't be hot next time. I'm sorry I'm ugly. I'll wear the mask." She thought she was the servant. She thought she was still begging for the right to exist in his world. Victor buried his face in her wet, matted hair and let out a sob that tore his throat raw. "No, Lily, you're not the servant. You're the master. You were always the master." Just then, the silence of the cabin was shattered. Ringtone. Wedding march. The massive OLED screen on the dashboard lit up. The caller ID flashed a perfectly airbrushed photo. My future. It was Tiffany. Victor stared at the screen. The contrast was nauseating. On his lap lay a woman who had let her face be melted to save his company. On the screen was a woman who had panicked last week because a waiter poured sparkling water instead of still. The Bluetooth connected automatically. "Babe?" Tiffany's voice filled the cabin, high-pitched and dripping with vocal fry. "Oh my God, finally! Listen, we have a crisis." Victor didn't speak. He just breathed, the sound of his rage filling the air. "The engagement ring," Tiffany continued, oblivious. "The jagged edge of the diamond is snagging my silk dress. It ruined the Vera Wang. I told you we needed the cushion cut. We need to go to the jeweler immediately. This is unacceptable." Unacceptable. The word hung in the air, vibrating against the sound of Lily's ragged, dying breaths. Tiffany was worried about silk. Lily was worried about serving tea while her skin was on fire. Something inside Victor, the last remnant of the man who cared about appearances, snapped. "Victor, are you listening to me? I said my dress is ruined." "Get out," Victor whispered. "Excuse me? Get out!" Victor screamed, his voice exploding with the force of a bomb. "Get out of my life! Get out of my house! If you are there when I get back, I will have you thrown into the street." "Victor, you're scaring me. Is this about the prenup? I'm carrying your son." "You're carrying a lie," Victor bellowed, his fist coming down. Crash. He punched the center console. The $1 million screen shattered. Glass and sparks flew into the air. The image of Tiffany's perfect face fractured into 1,000 jagged shards before fading into black. Silence returned, heavy and final. Victor looked up at the driver, his eyes wild, his knuckles bleeding. "Mass General Hospital," Victor ordered, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "Trauma unit." "Sir, the speed limit." "Drive on the sidewalk if you have to," Victor snarled, pulling Lily closer to his chest. "If she dies, we all die. Drive." The electric engine whined, unleashing 700 horsepower instantly. The Rolls-Royce tore away from Obsidian Ridge, leaving the mud, the egg, and the empty dynasty in the rearview mirror, racing against death to save the only thing that had ever been real. The autumn sun draped the coast of Rhode Island in a quilt of heavy, golden light, a stark contradiction to the bruising purple storm that had battered Obsidian Ridge exactly 1 year ago. The wind was no longer a shriek of fury. It was a whisper, rustling the copper beech trees that lined the private drive. The matte black Rolls-Royce Spectre was gone. In its place, parked on the gravel shoulder, sat a navy blue Volvo SUV, safe, practical, and covered in a thin layer of honest road dust. Victor Vance stepped out of the driver's seat. He wasn't wearing the $10,000 Tom Ford trench coat. He wore a cable-knit sweater and corduroys. His hair, once dyed jet black to hide any sign of weakness, was now peppered with distinguished silver at the temples. He didn't check a Cartier watch. He didn't have a schedule. The Wolf of Wall Street was dead. He had died in the back of a speeding car, holding a freezing woman to his chest. The last 12 months had been a brutal, beautiful purgatory. Victor had resigned as CEO of Vance Biocorp 3 days after the storm, handing the reins to a board that was stunned into silence. He had traded the boardroom for a hospital room in Lausanne, Switzerland, holding Lily's hand through 4 grueling rounds of skin graft surgeries. He had watched her learn to smile again, painful millimeter by millimeter. But the true death of his ego had happened on live television 6 months ago. Victor remembered the press conference. He had stood before the Shark Tank of global media, not to announce a merger, but to release his own medical records. "I am not the continuation of a bloodline," he had told the world, flashing the document that proved his sterility, the document Lily had destroyed her life to hide. The Vance legacy will no longer be defined by biology, but by humanity. The stock had dipped for an hour. Then, as the internet embraced the raw honesty of a titan admitting his vulnerability, it had soared to heights Eleanor never could have imagined. "Victor?" A soft voice pulled him from his reverie. He turned. Lily was standing by the open door of the SUV. She wore a simple white linen dress that caught the ocean breeze. She wasn't hiding behind a veil. The left side of her face was still a map of trauma, the skin tighter, the texture different, but the angry red burns had faded to a pale, translucent pearl. She wore her scars not as a badge of shame, but as proof of survival. In her arms, she held a squirming, laughing 3-year-old boy, Leo. They hadn't bought a baby. They hadn't used a surrogate. They had found Leo in the foster system, a boy deemed hard to place because of a severe cleft lip that mirrored the scars on his new mother's face. "He wants to run," Lily smiled, setting the boy down. Leo took off toward the mausoleum with the clumsy, joyous gait of a toddler, clutching a toy truck. He didn't see a graveyard, he saw a park. Victor walked over to his wife. He didn't tower over her anymore. He walked beside her. They ascended the hill, the same path Victor had marched up in his Italian loafers a year ago to deliver a diamond egg. The mausoleum gleamed in the sunlight. The mud was gone, replaced by manicured grass. Lily stopped at the base of the tomb. The spot where she had once huddled in rags, scrubbing blood from the stone with her bare hands, was now dry and warm. She was holding a bouquet. Not the ostentatious, rare Juliet roses Victor had brought. She held a bundle of simple white lilies. Victor watched, his breath caught in his throat. He expected her to spit on the grave. He expected her to curse the woman who had boiled the skin off her face. Instead, Lily knelt. She placed the flowers gently against the marble, right over the name Eleanor Rose Vance. "The tea is cold now, Eleanor," Lily whispered, her voice steady, free of the terror that had once enslaved her. "Rest. No one is angry anymore." It was an act of grace so profound it brought Victor to his knees. He watched Leo chasing a butterfly near the cliff edge, safe behind the new fence Victor had built with his own hands. Then he looked at Lily, who was struggling with the lace of her sneaker, her range of motion still limited by the scar tissue on her neck. Victor didn't hesitate. He knelt in the grass. A year ago, he had kicked a bucket of water out of her hands in this exact spot. He had stood tall in his arrogance while she cowered in the mud. Now, the billionaire humbled himself. He took the laces of her cheap canvas shoe in his hands. He tied them carefully, methodically, double knotting them to ensure she wouldn't trip. He looked up at her. The sun caught the melted ruins of her cheek, and to Victor, she was more beautiful than any untouched supermodel he had ever dated. "Ready to go home?" he asked, looking up at her with eyes that finally saw clearly. Lily touched his graying hair, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "Yes, let's go home." Victor stood up. He picked up Leo, swinging the boy onto his shoulders. The child laughed, a sound that chased away the last ghosts of Obsidian Ridge. They walked back down the hill, leaving the cold marble of the ancestors behind. They didn't look back at the crypt. They walked toward the Volvo, toward a dinner of spaghetti and meatballs, toward a life that wasn't measured in stock prices, but in the quiet, priceless currency of being whole. The Vance dynasty of blood ended that day. The Vance family had just begun. The legacy of Obsidian Ridge exposes the hollow fragility of ego and the deceptive nature of wealth. Victor Vance believed he was a king building an empire, only to realize he was a pauper standing on the silent sacrifices of the woman he scorned. The story serves as a brutal reminder that we often demonize those who love us most simply to protect our own pride. True legacy is not defined by DNA, dynastic power, or unblemished skin, but by the capacity to forgive the unforgivable and the wisdom to value a scarred truth over a beautiful lie. Now, if you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know which part surprised you the most. Every subscription and comment from you is a huge motivation for us to keep sharing more meaningful stories in life. Thank you so much.